All right, so picture this. You're a CEO right at the top of some huge company. You've got investors on your back, competitors trying to take you down. And the global economy is like, well, it feels like a roller coaster that's going way too fast. And on top of everything else, inflation's going crazy. So the question is, why is inflation like a CEO's worst nightmare? That's what we're going to deep dive into today.
We're going to be looking at inflation just from the point of view of corporate finance, all the hard decisions those executives have to make. We've got some really good sources lined up. We've got research from the Federal Reserve reports, from the World Economic Forum, analyses from institutions like Freddie Mac and Deloitte, even a really interesting article from Psychology Today.
So it's like a crash course in how to survive in this crazy economy.
Yeah.
But specifically for the people making the big decisions in the corporate world.
Yeah, exactly. Now, to really get what CEOs are dealing with, we need to start with the big picture. The OECD report, it makes things look pretty uncertain economically, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does feel like everything's always changing. What really got me was how the OECD talks about how unpredictable and volatile inflation is. It's not just prices going up, it's the uncertainty that comes with it.
And that makes planning and forecasting so hard. Imagine trying to make long-term decisions when you don't even know what your costs are going to be next quarter, let alone next year.
No wonder CEOs are stressed. But it's not just inflation they're dealing with. The BlackRock report talks about these mega forces changing the economy, things like AI and going green.
What's fascinating is that BlackRock compares these changes to the Industrial Revolution. Can you imagine trying to run a company through that kind of change while also dealing with crazy inflation?
Talk about a high-pressure job.
Yeah.
It's like juggling while riding a unicycle on a tightrope.
It's a perfect storm of challenges. And this is where the Deloitte report really gets it. It talks about inflation as this huge problem that affects every part of corporate finance.
Let's break that down. What are some of the key areas where CEOs are really feeling the pressure?
Well, supply chain problems are a big one. Remember when the COVID lockdowns happened and we saw how fragile global supply chains are?
Yeah, it felt like the whole world was waiting for those container ships to get unloaded.
Exactly. And the BIS quarterly review says that this fragility is even worse with inflation. Because when you have problems in the supply chain and prices are going up, it's the perfect recipe for shortages and delays.
And those delays mean higher costs for businesses, which then get passed on to us.
Yeah.
It's a vicious cycle. But wait, didn't Deloitte also say something about labor costs?
Absolutely. Deloitte, along with some research from Paycor, they say that labor costs are often the biggest expense for companies. And with inflation, those costs are going through the roof.
Right, because employees need higher wages to keep up with the cost of living. And when it's hard to find workers, companies have to compete for talent, which pushes wages up even more.
It's a tough situation. CEOs are stuck between needing to control costs but also needing to attract and keep good employees. And this brings us to one of the most interesting parts of how inflation affects business pricing strategies.
Yeah, it feels like CEOs are walking on eggshells when it comes to pricing. They need to raise prices to protect their profits, but they're also scared of losing customers who are already struggling.
It's a balancing act. Raise prices too high and you might lose customers to your competitors. Don't raise them enough and your profits take a hit.
So how are companies dealing with this pricing problem?
Well, some are using a strategy called skimpflation. It was in that Psychology Today article we mentioned. It's a way for companies to keep prices the same but secretly reduce costs.
So it's not about actually raising prices, it's about being sneaky with what you're offering.
Exactly. Like, have you ever noticed your favorite bag of chips getting smaller or the quality of a product feeling a little worse but the price stayed the same? That's skimpflation.
Oh, wow, you're right. I have noticed that with some things, but I just thought it was me. Now I'm wondering what else they've been sneaking around with.
It's a smart move for businesses because it lets them keep making money without raising prices directly. But it can also make customers lose trust if they figure it out. It's a risky strategy.
It just shows how much pressure businesses are under to find ways to deal with inflation. But it's not just about playing defense. Some companies are using this as a chance to innovate.
That's true. The Deloitte report on AI in financial services had some great examples of that. Companies that are using AI early on are using it to make things more efficient, manage risks, and even get ahead of the competition.
AI is such a hot topic these days. Everyone's talking about it. But can you give me a real-world example of how it's being used to fight inflation?
Sure, imagine you're a bank. With AI, you can analyze tons of data to predict demand more accurately. This can help you adjust prices on the fly, like changing loan rates or fees based on what's happening in the market.
So it's about being quick and responsive, using data to stay one step ahead.
Exactly. AI can also help spot potential loan defaults or fraud, which can happen more often when the economy is uncertain.
It's like AI is giving businesses a superpower, helping them see through the confusion of inflation and make smarter decisions.
And this goes back to what BlackRock was saying about those mega forces. Companies that embrace new technology like AI might be better at dealing with inflation and come out stronger in the end.
It's like survival of the fittest for businesses.
Yeah.
The ones that adapt and innovate will thrive. The ones that stick with old ways might get left behind.
That's a great way to put it. But it's not just about technology. CEOs also need to be smart about their financial planning.
But what does that look like practically? What are some things CEOs are doing to manage inflation?
One thing is focusing on controlling costs. This could mean negotiating better deals with suppliers, cutting unnecessary expenses, or even putting off investments that aren't crucial.
It's like tightening your belt and being more careful with your money.
Exactly. But it's not just about cutting costs. CEOs also need to think about how to protect their revenue streams.
How do they do that when customers are becoming more sensitive to price changes?
One option is to focus on creating new products or services that meet the needs of customers in a world with inflation.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, let's say you're a food company. You could create a line of affordable products for people who are trying to save money. Or if you're a retailer, you could offer more value brands or store brand products that have competitive prices.
It's about understanding what your customers are going through and giving them what they need.
Exactly. Another strategy is to build stronger relationships with your most important suppliers. This can help you make sure you have a steady supply of goods and services at prices you can predict, even when things are unpredictable.
It's about working together to get through tough times.
Right. And then, of course, there's the option of raising capital. This could mean taking on debt, issuing equity, or even finding strategic investors.
Like, isn't that risky, especially with interest rates going up?
It can be. But if it's done strategically, it can give the company the money it needs to survive the tough times and invest in growth opportunities.
So it's about weighing the risks and rewards, making smart bets on the future.
Exactly. Now let's change gears for a second and talk about the Federal Reserve. We know they play a huge role in managing inflation. The FedES notes from their research look into some interesting areas.
Like, what I'm curious about what the Fed is focusing on.
Well, one thing they've been studying is how volatile interest rates affect economic activity. They've found that when interest rates are unpredictable, businesses are less likely to invest and hire. This can slow down the economy, which makes it harder to control inflation.
It's like trying to hit a moving target with interest rates.
Exactly. And this uncertainty makes financial planning even harder for CEOs. They need to make decisions about investments, hiring, and expansion, but they're doing it with all this uncertainty hanging over them.
It's like trying to plan for the future when you don't know what the rules are going to be.
Another thing the Fed is looking into is the flow of money into the United States. They're analyzing whether things like trade wars and pandemics are causing fragmentation in the global financial system.
Okay, can you explain what fragmentation means in this context?
It basically means that the global financial system is breaking apart, with countries becoming more isolated financially. This can lead to higher borrowing costs, less investment, and slower economic growth.
And that just makes inflation worse, right?
Exactly. It creates a vicious cycle that's hard to break. Now let's move on to Goldman Sachs. In their inflation report, they have a pretty negative outlook for the S&P 500.
Oh no, negative. Tell me more.
Well, they're predicting that S&P 500 earnings will show no growth this year. Remember, last year's performance was mostly about valuations getting reset because of rising interest rates.
So if earnings don't improve this year, the market could be in for a rough ride.
That's what Goldman Sachs is saying. They even say that the risk of a recession in the U.S. might be the biggest risk for the global economy.
And it wouldn't be the first time the U.S. economy affected the rest of the world.
True. But even though there's a lot of talk about things going bad, Goldman Sachs also has a more optimistic scenario.
Okay, I'm listening. Give me some good news.
They think that if the U.S. can avoid a recession, it could actually lead to higher commodity prices and a recovery in non-U.S. equities.
So there's still hope for things to go well. This roller coaster ride isn't over yet.
Exactly. It all depends on what happens in the next few months.
So what are some other things that CEOs need to be watching out for?
Well, Freddie Mac's economic outlook gives us some good insights into the housing market.
Okay, what's going on with housing? It's been such a crazy few years.
Right. Well, Freddie Mac is predicting that mortgage rates will probably stay high for the rest of the year. This will keep making it hard for people to afford homes, which could slow down the housing market.
So it's not a good time to buy a house right now.
Not really, but Freddie Mac also says there's some good things happening.
Like what?
Well, first, they think the U.S. economy will avoid a recession, which would help stabilize the housing market.
That would be a relief for a lot of people.
They also expect job growth to stay strong, which would help keep demand for housing strong in the long run.
It's like a tug of war between good and bad forces.
Exactly. And in the middle of all this, you have CEOs trying to understand everything and make strategic decisions for their businesses.
So that's a complicated and constantly changing situation.
It is. And the World Economic Forum's report actually talks about some reasons why inflation might stay high all year.
I'm listening. Tell me what they found.
One of the main things they talk about is this trend of deglobalization.
What does that mean exactly?
It's basically the opposite of globalization. It means that countries are becoming more focused on protecting their own industries and less reliant on global trade.
We've definitely seen a shift in that direction lately with all the talk about bringing jobs back home.
Exactly. And the World Economic Forum says this trend is making inflation worse because it's making imported goods and services more expensive.
That makes sense. If you're relying more on making things domestically, it's probably going to cost more.
They also talk about how countries are using trade sanctions more often as a way to put political pressure on each other.
We've seen that happening a lot in recent years.
Right. And the World Economic Forum says these sanctions are messing up supply chains and making things more expensive for consumers.
It's like a political game with real economic consequences.
It is. And then, of course, there's the war in Ukraine, which has had a huge impact on energy and commodity markets around the world.
That's been a major reason for inflation everywhere.
The World Economic Forum says that as long as the war continues, it will keep pushing prices up.
It's a reminder of how connected the world really is.
Now, besides those global political factors, the World Economic Forum also talks about more fundamental reasons why inflation might stick around.
I'm curious, what are those?
One of the biggest concerns is the aging population in a lot of developed countries.
Okay, how does that relate to inflation?
Well, as the workforce gets smaller, it can lead to worker shortages, which drives up wages and eventually prices.
It's like supply and demand, but for people.
Exactly. And then there's climate change.
That seems to be a factor in almost every big issue these days.
You're right. Climate change is causing more extreme weather, which can disrupt agriculture and lead to higher food prices.
It's like a ripple effect, but on a global scale.
And lastly, the World Economic Forum highlights how government policies can either make inflation worse or better.
That makes sense. Governments have a lot of tools they can use.
They do. Things like government spending, monetary policy, and even regulations can all affect prices.
So it's a complicated mix of things that are driving inflation.
It is.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so hard for CEOs to deal with.
It feels like we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about global economic trends, geopolitical risks, technological advancements, and even what the Fed is doing. It's clear that inflation is a multifaceted challenge with no simple solutions.
That's right. But even with all the complexity, I think there are some key things for CEOs and business leaders to remember as they try to navigate this inflationary environment.
Okay, let's hear them. What are the most important things for CEOs to keep in mind? Okay, let's hear them. What are the most important things for CEOs to keep in mind?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be proactive, not reactive. So CEOs need to be thinking ahead, anticipating problems, and coming up with backup plans. For example, companies can use scenario planning to model different inflation situations and what those could mean for their business.
So it's all about being ready for anything. What else?
It's also about finding opportunities in the middle of all this change. Inflation can actually create chances for companies to innovate and stand out from the crowd. Like maybe they can focus on developing new products or services that meet what consumers need when prices are rising.
It's about turning a bad situation into a good one, finding a way to make the challenge work for you.
Exactly. And it's not just about new products. Companies can also get creative with their pricing strategies, like maybe they can try subscription models, dynamic pricing, or value-based pricing to make sure their prices match the value they're giving to customers.
It's about being flexible and adapting, always changing, to stay ahead of the game.
Absolutely. Another important strategy is to focus on running your business efficiently. This means finding ways to cut costs, streamline processes, and get more done. Companies can use automation, data analytics, and other digital tools to make their operations better and reduce waste.
It's about doing more with less, becoming leaner and more agile.
Exactly. And that's where technology can really help. But it's not just about what you do inside the company. CEOs also need to be aware of what's happening outside.
So they need to keep an eye on the world, understand the things that are shaping the global economy.
That's right. And it's also about building good relationships with important people like customers, suppliers, and policymakers.
It's about working together and communicating clearly to get through these tough times.
Now, before we finish, I want to mention one more source, the IMF working paper on the economic impacts and regulation of AI.
Okay, why this source?
Well, it talks about how AI could both make inequality worse and make it better. On one hand, AI could cause people to lose their jobs in certain sectors, which could widen the gap between skilled and unskilled workers. But on the other hand, AI could also create new opportunities for economic growth and new jobs, potentially helping people get out of poverty.
It's a two-sided coin, a powerful tool that could have both good and bad effects.
Exactly. The paper also stresses how important it is to regulate AI to make sure it's developed and used ethically and responsibly.
Regulation is key, especially with a technology as powerful as AI.
Absolutely. It's a complicated and ever-changing situation, but it's one that CEOs and policymakers need to be watching closely.
So to wrap it all up, inflation is a huge challenge, but it's not impossible to overcome. The CEOs who embrace innovation, prioritize efficiency, and lead with empathy are the ones who will not only survive, but thrive in the end.
I completely agree. And even though our deep dive today has given us a good foundation, it's just the start of the conversation.
You're right. It's made me think of even more questions, like how will using more AI change the future of work? What will governments do to regulate these new technologies? And how can we make sure that the benefits of innovation are shared fairly across society?
Those are great questions, and ones that we'll definitely be exploring more in future deep dives.
I'm looking forward to it. But for now, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about.
I agree. Hopefully they'll leave today feeling more informed and better equipped to handle the challenges of inflation.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of inflation. We'll see you next time for another exciting exploration of the things that are shaping our world.